Welcome to the Armed Citizens Educational Foundation's video channel. Today, let's talk about one of the most common questions we're asked. Nearly every week, an Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network member or an Armed Citizens who is interested in becoming a network member asks if we would assist a member who uses force in defense of their church, temple, or synagogue, their house of worship. So long as the member serves in an entirely volunteer capacity, our assistance encompasses volunteering on the church safety team, as well as after self-defense in their private lives. This educational interview is also applicable to a member defending him or herself and others at venues like private schools, a business that you operate, or a community service at which you volunteer. Network Advisory Board member and attorney Emanuel Kapelsohn, who is very active in organizing and training church defense teams, has agreed to help us better understand the responsibilities and concerns arising when volunteers organize to look out for the safety of their fellow worshipers. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us, Manny. And let me start, if I could, with a two-part question. Can you give us a little resume of your work and then take us right into ways that we can address safety challenges that face congregations?
Thank you, Gila, and thanks for having me on. I'm in my early 70s. Many years ago, I got an undergraduate degree with honors from Yale University and a law degree from Harvard Law School, and I've practiced law on and off since 1978. I started practicing law with a firm in New York City. I did that for about 5.5 years. We were litigators in cases all over the country, mainly in federal court. Then there was a period of 11 years when I didn't practice law at all, and I spent my time doing firearms training and security work and executive protection work. I was a staff instructor at Gun Site under Colonel Jeff Cooper. I taught all over the country. I've been a police firearms instructor and a defensive firearms instructor for 45 years now. Along the way, I became an expert witness in court cases that involved firearms, use of force, crimes committed with weapons, self-defense cases, products liability cases involving guns and holsters and related products. And I've been an expert witness like that for 39 years now in state and federal courts all over the country. I've been an advisory board member of the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network for about the last, 8 or 9 years, I think. And it's a wonderful organization. I'm also a reserve deputy sheriff. That's an armed sworn position. I've done that for 27 years in 2 sheriff's departments in the 2 states that I've lived in during that period of time. In more recent years, I've spent a lot of time helping to develop and organize and train and supervise armed congregant security teams for houses of worship. I've done that for several churches, one large synagogue, a faith-based community center, a private school, and some others. I've been actually involved in working, not only training, but working on the armed security team for a large church near us. And that involves me most every Sunday morning and some holidays as well. In order to preserve the anonymity of the church, I'll refer to it as Good Church. So that's not its real name, but that's what I'll call it, Good Church. So the Good Church armed security team is about 35 in number. On a typical Sunday morning at Good Church, we will have services at 8 a.m., 9:30, and 11 a.m. And at 2 of those times, we have a second service going on as well in a smaller venue called the chapel. And in addition to that, we have daycare for little kids and Sunday school and Sunday activities for everyone up through high school age, and Bible study classes for adults. And the net result of all that is that on a typical Sunday, between 8 a.m. and 12:30, there will be 2,200 to 2,500 people coming through Good Church for one service or activity or another. And the goal of the security program is to have at least 5 armed congregant security team members there at all times. So it isn't necessarily one person who's there from 8 a.m. till 12:30. One person may cover the 8 a.m. service or the 8 a.m. and the 9:30 service and then leave, and someone else may come on, but there should be at least 5 at all times. We also have a medical team in addition to the armed congregant security team. The medical team is typically composed of people who are paramedics or EMTs, or have some other advanced medical training, in addition to which the armed security team members have first aid type training, tourniquets and CPR and such. So it's quite a good program. It's an extensive program, and I've worked with that program for about the last 5 or 6 years, as I've mentioned. To go into the second question you asked, which is to introduce us to the idea of an armed congregant security team. I think we're all familiar with the active killer or active shooter problem that exists. And some people who work in this field object to it being called active shooter because sometimes it's someone with a knife, not a gun, and shooters are good people. We're all shooters, we're all gun users, and some of us are competitive shooters. And some of the highest body count of events in history were not committed with guns. They were committed with things like a gallon of gasoline or sticks of dynamite or something of that sort, or a vehicle driven through a crowd. So it's not always a shooter. But the problem exists, and it exists not only in the United States, but in all countries around the world, as far as I can tell. We hear about the events in the United States, and sometimes political figures or media people say, well, why is this a problem here in the United States and nowhere else? Well, it is a problem elsewhere. There have been these mass killing events everywhere from Russia and Canada to Japan to China to all over the world. A problem that is common to these active killer events is that they are usually over very quickly from start to finish. It is not uncommon for them to be over from start to finish in 5 or 6 or 7 minutes. In the United States, our best studies of this by the FBI and the Secret Service indicate that about 50% of the time, the event is over before the first police officer arrives on the scene. Exactly. So I've spoken to congregations, to their boards of directors or their trustees or their clergy groups or what have you, who say, well, we've got a plan. We're going to call 911. And of course, the police expression is 911. When seconds count, help is only minutes away. When you call 911, and I should mention that in many of these events, 3 or 4 minutes go by before the first call goes into 911, because you have to understand, someone starts shooting in a public place, whether that's a church or a synagogue or a school or a shopping center or an office building or a movie theater. The first thing people do is not call 911. The first thing people do is duck or run for cover or get under their seat in the theater or whatever it is. And it's not until a few minutes later that the first call goes into 911. Then the dispatcher has to take that call, dispatch police. The police have to get to the location. If it's a large venue, perhaps a school with several stories and dozens of classrooms, or an office building or what have you, the police have to find their way into where the problem is occurring. And often by then, the problem is over. because the person has either run out of ammunition and killed themselves, or fled the scene, or killed as many people as they intended to kill, or what have you. A friend of mine named Ron Borsch, who is a student, probably the most knowledgeable single person I know about active killer events in the United States and perhaps the world, calls this whole timeline the stopwatch of death. And the point he's making is that every second that goes by, not just minutes, but seconds, more people may be being killed. So you have to have some approach to this that isn't just we'll call 911 and wait for the police to arrive. The incidents that have been stopped right when they started, or maybe unfortunately, but maybe after just one or two people have been killed, have been stopped by people who are already there on the scene. Whether that's a school resource officer in the local high school or middle school, or whether it's an armed individual or an unarmed individual. A significant number of these active killer events are stopped by unarmed civilians, if you will, non-police, who tackle the person or hit the shooter with a chair or do whatever they can do to intervene in the event. In a house of worship today, it doesn't make sense to me not to have armed security, because houses of worship are targets of these events. And we have to understand that the goal of armed security in the house of worship is not to replace the police. It's not to deal with someone who's got their car double parked in the parking lot, or maybe even someone who's being a bit disruptive in a service. If that's a situation where the police can be called to deal with it, to evict a trespasser, or to deal with someone who's intoxicated or under the influence of drugs and needs to be removed, that's a police function. And so is protection of, I'll call it, mere property, protection of property as opposed to life. Those are police functions. Now, there are parts of the country where police are not as readily available as they are in others. I mean, we have suburban and urban areas where response time for police may be 2 or 3 minutes on a good day when there's not much going on. But then, I mean, I lived in a rural county in Indiana for 5 years, where the response by the sheriff's department, if the deputies who were on duty were over on the far side of the county, might be 20 minutes. And that's with lights and siren and no traffic to speak of, but that's how far away it was. And there are a lot of parts of the country where a police response is further away than that. So I think it behooves a congregation to have some planning and some armed security. Now, then we get to, what are the purposes of this armed security if they're not to replace the police? And I think that your security team, or at Good Church, we call it the SAFE team. In some other places, I hear it called the safety team or the security team or what have you. But the duties of that team may not only be an armed response to an armed attacker. It may be providing first aid. And as I've said, at Good Church, there's a special medical team. But at many congregations that are not as big as Good Church, the security team will provide a first aid function. And they should certainly be trained in things like CPR and regular first aid functions, treatment for shock, and how do you stop massive bleeding, whether that's with tourniquets or Israeli bandages or quick clot, combat gauze. Whatever the system is, they should be trained in it. The security team may also be trained in helping to evacuate the building in the event of a fire or perhaps a bomb threat, where there might be a decision to evacuate, because there isn't always a decision to evacuate for a bomb threat. Depends on many details that are beyond our subject today. the security team may be doing things as mundane as looking for a lost child. At Good Church, we've had a number of instances where the child gets separated from the parents, and the parents are looking for the child, or the child is looking for the parents. Sometimes the parents don't even know the child's lost yet, and the security team is a help in that regard. So there are many, many functions that the SAFE team can serve. The most important preliminary consideration is that the clergy of whatever congregation it is must buy into this idea of having an armed security team. If the clergy isn't for it, it's not going to work. And in some congregations, depending on their size and the makeup of the congregation may need to buy in to it as well. I've been a member of congregations like the one that I've mentioned to you that have thousands of members, and I've been a member of what are typically called family churches. In my case, it was in the Midwest, where there are several families, and the typical turnout on a Sunday morning for services might be 15 people or 20 people. Well, it's just like the difference between fielding a varsity football team in a Big Ten school that has 40,000 students. So you've got a large field of candidates to choose from for your varsity football team, and having a football team in a small school that has 100 students or 200 students, you're not going to have the same kind of football team. In police departments, the example I think of often is, I'll work with some police departments because I'm very active still in law enforcement firearms training all over the country. Work with some police departments that have 11 or 12 officers. Well, that's not a department that can have a SWAT team unless you happen to have 11 or 12 officers who all happen to come from SEAL Team 6 or whatever it might be. That's a department that needs to participate in a county-wide or similar multi-agency tactical team, because there aren't going to be qualified people for a tactical team, enough for a tactical team in that small number of officers. And of course, some people are going to be off duty at the time, or on vacation, or on sick leave at the time, and then the chief or someone else has to be in charge of the incident, not on the entry team. So the nature of the armed security provisions will naturally depend on the size of the congregation and the makeup of the congregation. In a large congregation like Good Church, you can have an armed congregant team. You can have a large enough armed congregant team that you have different people coming to different services or different weekends during the month. And of course, you want people also to be able to go to the services to participate in worshiping, not just be there for a security function. So it's common at Good Church for someone to come who's on the SAFE team for 2 services in a row. And one service, they are assigned a security post, and the other service, they're in the service participating in worship. And if you had something like the family churches I mentioned before, where you might only have 12 or 15 or 20 people there on a typical Sunday morning, it might not be a matter of a team that are assigned security posts or positions or sectors of responsibility. It might just be a number of congregants who are people who carry guns anyway. They have concealed carry permits, and you provide them with training about the law and about appropriate responses to different situations, maybe first aid training and so forth. And they're just coming with their families, and as they would to a normal worship service, but they are prepared to respond in an armed capacity if that terrible terrible event becomes necessary. So those are some of the first things that I think need to be thought about.
What is the legal component of the state laws about concealed carry, licensing of armed security guards? Where does that fit into this? Are they employees of the congregation?
That's going to be a matter of state law, and it's going to vary from state to state. So there are 50 different formulas for that. I wouldn't attempt to address it here, but just to make people aware of the issue. Obviously, one of the preliminary considerations, if you're thinking about having an armed congregant team, is the consideration of, is it legal? And what steps need to be taken to make it legal? Is this a state where concealed carry permits are available and are necessary for anyone carrying a gun concealed? Is it a so-called constitutional carry state where permits are no longer necessary? In some of those states where permits are no longer necessary, permits are still available to those who wish to apply for them. And that may be a good thing for a security team, because the process of applying for and getting a permit means you've been put through a criminal background check, a criminal history check by the police. So that assures us that Parishioner Smith, who may have been a member of this congregation for 12 years, and we all think we know him very well, doesn't have a felony somewhere back on his record before that 12 years when he lived in a different state and went to a different congregation. So there's an advantage to getting concealed carry permits in places where they are available. In some states, like my own home state of Pennsylvania, someone who is an employee, as defined by law, who works in an armed capacity as a requirement of their job, such as an armed security guard or an armored car crew member or a bank guard or an armed private investigator, any of those people who work in an armed capacity as part of their job but are not law enforcement officers, must have certain state required training and licensure. In Pennsylvania, it's called Act 235. It requires a 40-hour course unless you have previous law enforcement experience. And then it has to be renewed every 5 years. And so you have to have an Act 235 card. Well, to the best of my understanding and legal judgment, someone who's a member of a congregation who is just carrying their gun and maybe even helping serve a security function, but on a purely volunteer basis, is not an employee. They're a volunteer, and so they don't need that Act 235 licensing. That's my best guess on that. I'm not trying to give legal advice here. I'm just trying to address the subject. In some states, if that congregant gets any benefits from their job, if they get free cookies and milk every time they show up, that might be considered compensation, and that might be considered to make them an employee, not a volunteer. And depending on what state it is, that may change the situation. So this needs to be looked at. Another thing that's a preliminary consideration is the insurance consideration. There are some insurance companies that issue insurance to houses of worship and to other businesses where the insurance does not cover and will not cover that facility or that operation or activity if there are any armed protectors, whether they are an armed security guard service, even though it has its own liability coverage, or whether it's armed congregants in a church or a synagogue or a temple or what have you. I was involved in such a situation where the congregation I was part of wanted to have armed security guard service. And the insurance carrier said, no, not with us, you won't. We won't cover for that. So we had to find another insurance carrier. There are two very large insurance companies. One is called Church Mutual, and the other is called Brotherhood Mutual, that both cover, among other things, houses of worship, and they will cover houses of worship with armed security, including armed congregant security. They want to know that you have a training program. They want to know something about the setup of the program, but they will cover that. And in fact, when the one congregation that I was part of was told by our insurance carrier that it would not cover for us if we had the armed security guards, we found that one of these other insurance companies would provide us more coverage, $1 million more coverage, in fact, at a lower annual premium with our ability to have armed security. So some of these are excellent companies. I mentioned two. There are undoubtedly others, but those are two I know about. And insurance is an issue. You want to be sure that your insurance coverage does cover. One of the congregations I was affiliated with also required each member of the armed congregant team to have his or her own insurance coverage or similar to insurance coverage, something like armed citizens membership, something that would provide financial support in the event of a claim being made. You might say, well, why does the individual need it? The congregation's liability coverage should cover it. Yes, it did cover, but they wanted to make sure that the individuals had it as well. So if it was a situation where for some reason the congregation's insurance wouldn't cover, the person would still have their own financial support if a claim were made. And it was also a way of making sure that the members of the team kind of bought into this, just like we're asking the clergy and the congregation to buy into it. In other words, it's a reality check. Are you really serious about doing this? Do you understand that there are potential liability ramifications?
I think there's a big branching between coverage, like the insurance company saying liability, maybe there's a missed shot or someone is an incorrect decision is made. You're going to have a liability situation. And that's not what Armed Citizens Network gets involved in. We're all about paying for the defense of that team member. And we do get a lot of questions about that and say we would count it a privilege to take care of God's people and make sure that their legal expenses were taken care of by the network. And so we wouldn't get involved in that liability side of things, but to take care of that armed congregant, oh yes, over and over.
Well, thanks for clarifying that. And sometimes people ask me the question, whether in a congregation that I'm involved in or just some other congregation, they say, well, if I become a member of an armed security team, might I have some personal liability? Well, of course you will. I mean, if it snows and you don't shovel your front walk well enough and the UPS man slips and hurts his back, you've got liability. If you have a car accident, you've got potential liability. And whether ultimately you have liability or not, that's a secondary question. The first question is, can I be sued? Of course you can. People can sue you for virtually anything. And if you carry a gun in your personal life, there's a responsibility that's connected with that, and there's a potential liability that's connected with that. So something like Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network is so important for people. I guess the next thing I'd say is, if you're going to have an armed team, it should be something that is known to your local police, whoever they are. So if they respond to an incident, they're not surprised that there may be some congregants there, possibly even with drawn guns, holding someone at gunpoint or whatever it may be, who aren't bad guys. The police need to know that. We have a good relationship with our local police. We have a good relationship with our district attorney's office. Both of them kind of gave the thumbs up to this program before it was started. The district attorney's office has sometimes come in and taught legal programs for one of the teams that I'm connected with. But this is important, and other first responders need to know this information too, whether that's your local ambulance squad or your local fire department, because if there is some mass casualty event, they're all going to be arriving. And at some point, if you've got a large enough congregation and a large enough team, you may be thinking of having some kind of training exercise that involves these others, whether it's a tabletop exercise or whether it's just coordinating in a meeting or two, or whether it's an actual simulated event training exercise that involves your local ambulance crew or your local fire company or what have you, because they may all be involved, and prior coordination and prior training is the way to go. I guess the next thing I would think about, Gila, is how do we select the team members? I recently saw a suggestion that I thought was terrible, a terrible way to select team members. And that was, well, just put a notice in your church newsletter saying we're now accepting applications for armed security team members. Anybody who's interested, please see so-and-so about it. I just think that's an awful way to do it.
Why?
Well, first of all, you are announcing to the world that you have armed security. You may not want to announce that to the world. Everyone in the world may not be your friend. And whether that's someone who's a potential attacker, or whether it's an unfriendly voice in the local media or whatever it is, I don't think that's something you want to announce publicly any more than you would say, well, our building is, you published an article in the paper telling the world, our building is now installing a burglar alarm system, and here's where the sensors are, and here's how it works. I mean, that's not information the world needs to know. The other thing is, you may get people applying that aren't the people you want. I think that a much better way is, in a congregation, hopefully there are congregants that you know well, and people you trust, people you think would be good assets for such a team. Ideally, they'd be people that already have some firearms knowledge if it's going to be an armed team. Any first responders are good members of that kind of team if their first responder duties won't take them away from your congregation when they're needed. In other words, in the large congregation in good church, we have a number of members on our team who are retired police officers or state troopers. Municipal police officers. We have one who's a judge. We have people with extensive prior military training, maybe even as military police. People who are firefighters or EMTs. These are people who have experience dealing with critical incidents and with stressful emergencies, and they would potentially make good members of the team. What we do is we recommend people from within our own congregation. In other words, someone on the team will say, my friend Joe Smith, who also attends our congregation, he and I go shooting together. He's a great guy. He's a family man. He has good religious values, and he's got some experience with firearms. And I think he'd be a good member of the team. There should be some leadership group, whether that's a member of the clergy of the congregation plus one or two members of the team, that evaluate that proposal to put that person on the team. In two sizable congregations that I've been a member of, we have an actual written application form where we ask the person to fill this out and provide various information about themselves. And that form then sometimes serves as the basis for an in-person interview that we do. Maybe interviewing someone that you know personally, but you haven't addressed these kinds of subjects, like, how does your spouse feel about you being on an armed congregant security team? Is this going to cause a problem in your family? Do you have the time to do this? Will you be able to devote, X number of training sessions per year? And are you willing to pay for some equipment that you may need that's in addition to what the congregation provides to you. And equipment is an issue that we should mention. But that's, I think that's a better way to try to find people for the team. It's important that a member of the clergy of your congregation be one of the leadership committee or the committee that helps choose who's going to be on the team or who's proposed for the team, because sometimes the clergy will have privy to information that the rest of the congregation does not. This congregant may have come to them and told them that he or she has an alcohol or drug problem, or who knows what the situation is, where the clergyman may just say to the leadership committee, well, I don't think Joe Smith's a good applicant right now. Maybe after a little while, but we need to let this wait. Let's pass on him for the time being. It's a tough situation.
And I'm wondering, are you even doing formal background checks absent a CPL? And how does this scale to your smaller congregation?
We do several things. In our state, a concealed carry permit is still required. It's not a constitutional carry state. So the fact that someone has that CCW means that they have gone through a criminal background check conducted by law enforcement. So that's one thing. We then require them to get the two child care certifications that any teacher or daycare worker would have to have in order to work with children. And so one is a state certification and one is a federal certification, and they are both free for volunteer workers. But we require them to have them, and we require them to update them. They have to be updated. I think it's every 3 years or something like that they have to be updated. We require that. So the team becomes a recipient of a copy of the person's concealed carry permit, and also of the paperwork that shows they have passed the child care certifications, that they have nothing negative in their history in that regard. And I mentioned that we interview the people, and there are two standards that I can think of that are maybe useful to people to consider. I mentioned that years ago I was a staff instructor at Gun Sight, or the American Pistol Institute, and the classes that we taught there, which were defensive handgun and shotgun and rifle classes at different levels of ability, typically started on a Monday morning and finished Saturday at noontime with man-on-man competition and standards drills for score. And the people who went through that school could get one of several different certifications coming out of it. The highest was expert, and I know, Gila, that you have an expert, or an e-ticket, as they say, from Gun Sight, which is quite an honor, because there are classes of 20 and 25 people where nobody gets an expert rating in the entire class. And so there's expert, and then there's marksman, etc. The standard that Colonel Cooper used for an expert rating, and this was determined at the end of the week after the people had all gone through a week of training with instructors looking over their shoulder the whole time, and shoot houses and outdoor tactical ranges and the man-on-man competition and the standards drills. The standard Cooper used for an expert rating was, is this someone you would choose to have with you in a fight? Is this someone you would choose to have with you in a fight? And if the answer was no, I'd rather pick somebody else, that person didn't get an expert rating, even if they came in first in the man-on-man competition, which after all is just competitive shooting. Or if they came in first in the standards drills, which is marksmanship, speed and accuracy, because a lot is involved in wanting to have someone with you in a fight other than just how fast are they, how accurate are they, and can they win a competition? We're talking about people who have to be level-headed and have good judgment and able to handle stress well and so forth. So that was Cooper's standard. Is it someone you choose to have with you in a fight? And now I'll give you the good church standard. Our standard for the safe team in good church is, for the people interviewing the candidate, is this someone to whom you would entrust the care of your children? Children, hopefully, being the person's most precious possessions. And, there are people who might be, you might think of them as the world's best gunslinger, if there is such a thing. But you'd say, but I'm not leaving my kids with them. They're not the kind of person that in an emergency you would entrust your children to. And so I think a combination of those two standards, someone who's level-headed and trustworthy and has good judgment and is mature and even-tempered, and in all respects, someone to whom you would entrust the care of your children, and someone you would choose to have with you in a fight. I think if you combine those two, you have a standard which is admittedly very subjective, but I think we all understand what that standard is.
We get selected. You have this wonderful person. Now, are you going to control what they carry? Are you going to tell them how to show up for the service? What kind of equipment, even apparel? How are they going to get sealed? Do they have to not print? How are we going about this?
I can tell you what we do in good church as an example, and I think it's a good example. In good church, at any service, and I've told you how large it is and how many congregants come to services, people have name tags on lanyards around their neck, typically, a plastic square thing that's got their name on it. And that the people who have those name tags are greeters and ushers and building maintenance people, and also members of the safe team, and also members of the medical team. Well, the nameplates are color-coded. The world in general doesn't know what that code is, but the fact is that the safe team has a certain color nameplates, and our nameplates don't have our last name on them, just our first name. So mine says on it Emanuel. It doesn't have my last name on it. Yours would say Gila. It wouldn't have your last name on it. That nameplate also has the magnetic code in it that lets it open certain locked doors in the facility. The door into the child care area, the outer doors. So if you go outside a locked door for some reason and the door shuts behind you, you're not locked out. You can get back in by using that code to open the door. It's also the code to our security communications center, which is on the second floor. So that's one thing that we all have, is a nameplate. We don't have a dress code. You dress however is comfortable for you as someone attending services. And we have people like me who often wear a blazer because it's an easy way for me to cover my gun and my radio and whatever else I'm carrying. And we have other people who just wear a sports shirt. We don't carry guns openly. I'm sure there are many members of the congregation, especially ones who are visitors or new members of the congregation, who have no idea that there's anyone there carrying a gun. We are all issued radios. Some of us are issued radios that are assigned to us. Other people, when they get there to work on the safe team or the medical team, go up to the communication center and check out a radio for that tour of duty. Our radios have earbuds, and the wire goes into your collar, and so it's not very obvious to people. It's obvious to someone who wants to look for it. We train people in the use of pepper gel if they're on our safe team. We don't require them to carry it, but we strongly encourage them to carry it as a less lethal option. you should know that we also give people hand-to-hand defensive tactics training on a periodic basis. So whether they have the pepper gel or not, they do have means of using force other than deadly force. And we also issue people and require them to carry, whenever they are there armed, a security sash. These are the sashes made by DSM company. The initials stand for Don't Shoot Me. It's in a pouch on your belt, a little pouch, or in your pocket. And when you deploy it and put it over your head, it's a bright yellow or fluorescent green sash across your front and back. In our case, it says security on it, but DSM makes ones that say sheriff or police or what have you. And as soon as you can deploy that in a situation in which you draw your gun, you are supposed to deploy that so that arriving police or other congregants who may be armed but may not be part of the security team or the safe team know that you have an official capacity, that you're part of the security team. So that's some of the equipment that people are required to carry or urged to carry, depending on what it is. We have written policy, which I'll get into shortly, and the policy specifies the kinds of firearms that are acceptable to be carried, and it specifies that you must qualify with the firearm you're carrying, not just a similar one, but the actual one, that serial number, Glock or Smith & Wesson or Springfield or whatever it might be, and that the ammunition you are carrying must be controlled expansion ammunition, not full metal jacket. So in other words, it's something that's more likely to be contained in the person you shoot if you should have to shoot someone, and not pass through them and injure or kill someone else. So there are specific requirements, and people who are on the security team are prohibited from carrying other weapons which have not been approved and with which they have not been trained and qualified. In other words, they can't just decide to carry an expandable baton or a taser or something if that's not something that the team trains them with and authorizes, which in our case it is not. Okay, so they can't just carry whatever they want.
Do you mandate certain calibers?
We do. And we mandate that it be a minimum of 9mm or 38 special, and we mandate a certain range of calibers. We list certain manufacturers as approved manufacturers, and we say that if you want to carry some different model of gun by some other manufacturer, you need to get it approved by the person who's the team leader or the head firearms instructor for the team, so that we don't have someone using some bizarre kind of firearm. I had one member on a team that I worked with and trained who just was argued so strenuously that he wanted to carry a certain kind of gun in case the active killer was wearing body armor. This would go right through it. And I said, yes, and it'll go right through 3 congregants too when you miss it. You know, there is no good expanding ammunition made for this gun. And he said, oh, but the Secret Service carries it. And I said, well, with all due respect, you're not the Secret Service, and our function is different, and you can't carry that here. So yes, there's a good reason for the congregation to control what kind of weaponry people carry and to make sure that they're trained and qualified with it. So I guess now what I'm getting into now is our initial training. We've got this person who's been approved for team membership, and they've got their concealed carry permit, or if not, then figure out how to put them through a criminal background check in some other state that doesn't require that permit. And they've got the child care clearances. So they've got all those things, and they've passed the interview and all that. We require that our team members start with a 17-hour-long training program. In fact, I'm conducting one along with the pastor of our congregation this weekend. The pastor is also a certified firearms instructor, by the way. And that includes classroom training on the law in our state and on firearm safety and on mental preparation, alertness, and mental conditioning for this task, and other things. And it includes range training, everything from drawing and firing single and multiple shots to engaging multiple targets, reloading, clearing stoppages, firing in situations where there are innocents present that you have to miss. And then, among other things, it includes firing a qualification course of fire, similar to what a police department might fire. You've got to pass a written test in that class. If you don't pass it, you can't be on the team. You've got to qualify with your weapon. If you don't fire a qualifying score, you can't be on the team until you do. And maybe remedial training is needed, or more study is needed for the written test or whatever. But that's initial training that's required of people. And in addition to that, then we give our team members first aid training. That's not part of this weekend, but it's something that comes after they've been accepted for the team. They get the first aid training, they get the pepper gel training, they get the unarmed defensive tactics training. We've had many other kinds of training in service for our people, and that includes simunitions or airsoft training, man-on-man with role players. We've done video simulator training, both at our nearby police academy, and I've brought in a mobile video simulator from another one of our Pennsylvania police academies. We had it for 3 days. We put 42 people through that video simulator training. This is state-of-the-art training of a kind that police officers would go through. So we have more things coming up. We bring in lecturers to lecture on various topics. We have several training sessions throughout the year, in addition to the in-service firearms qualification sessions. So we do a wide variety of training, and the goal is to make people on the team competent and confident, and to develop the right mindset, and to make them alert and aware of things that they should be watching for. These are all things we do.
It is clear that there is a tremendous amount of detail that goes into selecting and equipping a team of volunteers to protect people who've come together to worship. We have not even touched on documenting their training and skill maintenance, and whether they guard assigned positions or simply join the rest of the congregation in the pews during services, and one element that will be challenging for many, creation of a use of force policy. I don't want to give short shrift to any of those topics or other aspects of armed church security about which we should be alerted. So with your understanding, I would like to take a break and come back to those and related topics for our next edition.